Pooka Pages is published 8 Sabbats per year at pookapages.com. Now, Pooka and Grimalkin's Yule Adventure by Lora Gaddis. Pooka pawned through the presents under the Yule tree.
Which ones are for me?
Elsie was busily knitting by the fire. She answered automatically.
You'll have to wait and see.
I know this one is,
cried Pooka happily.
I can smell the catnip right through the paper.
Step away from the package.
Warned his witch.
Not until Yule morning.
Pooka sighed. Edgar the Crow flew down from his perch and examined one crinkly small gift curiously. He cocked his head this way and that, and then pecked at it with his beak.
Mine?
He asked.
Edgar, shoo! Get away from the presents.
Scolded Elsie.
Honestly, you two are like a couple of naughty kids.
Edgar shrugged his wings. Pooka caught the bird's eyes and then gently raised his paw and tapped the popcorn and cranberry garland adorning the tree. Curious, Edgar hopped over to investigate. Tasty! The crow pulled and the garland began to unravel from the tree branches.
Edgar, no!
Cried Elsie as she leaped up from her chair. The large black bird squawked and flew back to his perch.
I didn't do it,
Pooka reminded his witch. He blinked up at her innocently.
Maybe not, but you're an instigator.
She returned to her chair and picked up her knitting again. Pooka wasn't sure what that meant, but it didn't sound good. The cat decided to get her in a good mood again. He jumped into her lap, butted his head against her chin, and purred loudly.
What are you making?
A stocking for you.
She told him.
And it's a little difficult with you parked right in front of me.
Pooka looked down at his paws. Did his witch really expect him to wear stockings?
When this one's done, I'll make one for Edgar,
said Elsie. The girl reached around the cat in her lap, peered over his head, and continued her knitting. Pooka did the math. He had 4 paws, and Edgar had 2 feet. Either way, one stocking for each of them didn't add up. He pointed this out very kindly to Elsie, and the witch chuckled.
They aren't for wearing. They're for hanging on the fireplace mantel.
Why? If we don't wear them, they won't get wet, and there's no need to dry them by the fire.
No, silly. We hang them for Father Yule to find.
The cat looked up at his witch's face.
Father who?
But Elsie just smiled and continued her stitches. On Yule Eve, there were such wonderful festivities. Uncle Tiberius and Aunt Tilly, with Pooka's little brother Grimalkin stuffed in her carpet bag, arrived by train the day before. Elsie put them up in her little guest room. Grandmother, Nathan, and Miss Epstein, the librarian, all came to share in their Yule feast. Afterward, Elsie pulled out her banjo mandolin, and they all sang carols celebrating the sun's rebirth. Even little Thistle the fairy flew by to wish them and was persuaded to stay for some gingerbread and eggnog. As the night wore on, the revelers yawned and one by one either went home or drifted off to bed. Pooka and little Grimalkin sat on the thick Persian carpet in the parlor and watched as Elsie hung stockings over the mantel. There was one for herself, one each for Aunt Tilly and Uncle Tiberius, and the 2 she'd made Pooka and Edgar. At the end, there was even a little stocking for Grimalkin.
What's she doing?
His little brother whispered.
Witches have strange, mysterious rituals,
Pooka whispered back.
I think this one is in honor of some great god called Father Yule.
When she was done, Elsie headed up the stairs toward her bedroom. Pooka trailed after her. She put on her nightgown and brushed her hair, then climbed into bed. The little black cat cuddled in with her. He thought about how they'd all rise before dawn the next morning and trek to the top of the hill to witness the new sun being born. He thought of how, when they got back to the cottage, there'd be warm eggnog, a big yummy breakfast, laughing and presents, and wondered how on earth was he ever going to get to sleep. But eventually he did. Snuggled in Elsie's arm, and beneath the warm quilt the little cat was softly snoring when something woke him. His head popped up. He heard it again, a soft clink and a faint rustle. The sound was downstairs. Pooka growled. He slid from under the quilt and off the bed, out of the room, and crept slowly down the stairs. An intruder was in the house. His fur stood straight up on his neck and puffed up his tail. Pooka was bravely determined to protect his witch and his presents. He reached the bottom step of the stairs and peeked cautiously around the corner into the parlor. A tall, bearded man stood before the fireplace mantel. He seemed to be putting something into one of the stockings. A wreath of holly encircled his head, and he was robed in green and brown. His sleeves and collar were trimmed in fur, and a large oak staff leaned against Elsie's wingback chair by the hearth. Outside the cottage window, Pooka could hear snuffling and snorting, and the impatient pawing of hooves. What sort of robber was this? And what was that outside? Pooka leaped straight in the air as something brushed against him. It was Grimalkin.
I heard something,
His little brother whispered. The kitten's eyes were huge in the light of the fireplace embers. The tall man at the hearth turned with Edgar's stocking in his hand and looked directly at the two cats. They both shrank back into the shadows.
Pooka and Grimalkin, you've both been very naughty this year.
The brothers looked at each other in astonishment. They knew they had, but how did he know?
Who are you?
Demanded Pooka.
I'm known throughout the world by many names, but to you, I'm Father Yule.
Are you a god?
Asked Pooka boldly. The tall man stroked his beard thoughtfully.
You could say I'm more of a spirit.
Tiny Grimalkin was huddled so tightly behind his big brother that his little nose was almost shoved up Pooka's butt. However, at this, he poked his face out and asked,
You mean you're a ghost?
The large man threw back his head and laughed. His merriment seemed to bounce around the walls of the room. He opened his arms as though embracing the whole world.
A ghost? Never. Not until people stop believing in the magic that happens during the winter solstice. No matter their belief or their religion, if they come together at this time of year in the spirit of love, kindness, giving, and rebirth, if they believe in the spirit of this blessed season, then they believe in me, and I am alive.
At this, Grimalkin grew even braver and stepped completely out from behind Pooka. He stomped right up to the great bearded man and looked up, his stubby kitten tail lashing back and forth angrily.
Well, why are you stealing our stockings?
This story and much more can be found at pookapages.com. Past stories of Pooka and his witch Elsie can also be found compiled in the books Elsie and Pooka, Stories of the Sabbats and Seasons, available on Amazon.com. This story written by Lora Gaddis, adapted and recorded by Doug Brown. Sound effects locally produced or from freesound.org.